Well, good evening. I too want to thank the organizers that have put this together tonight. I won't go through all the names, but I think Graham did a good job of that. The other thought I had, and forgive me, my mind kind of goes strange places sometimes, but as I was hearing Graham kind of finish up and he was making his case so strongly, my thought was, well, maybe we're getting to the point. It's a bit like my 4-year-old granddaughter who was out visiting us, and we went back, took them home to their parents, and we were going to a baseball game, and the little 4-year-old Rachel was kind of rambunctious, and she acted up a little bit. And so her mother was sitting in the front of the van, talking back to her and saying, we're going to the baseball game, you've got to behave now. You just got to behave. None of this nonsense. And so this is going on and going, and I'm sitting next to Rachel in the back, and under her breath she says, I get it, I get it, I get it. So that's what we're hoping. People will get it, will get it. Well, my challenge is to talk a bit about, we focused on moral issue, but I'm going to stretch it a little bit and say, is it a spiritual issue as well? And I'm going to kind of tackle that a little bit with my stumbling, bumbling theology, all right? I was thinking about when this first was an issue for me, and it's kind of embarrassing in a way because it's so long ago, and I don't think I've done that much about it. I remember being at an Urbana missions conference. The InterVarsity sponsors this. Some of you who probably know about, some of you maybe even attended. I think this was back in the early 70s maybe. And one of the friends that I'd gone to an InterVarsity camp with, I bumped into him, and I remember him saying to me, the environment's the issue. We've got to deal with the environment. And this was in the early 70s. And that's the first time that I can recall that I kind of got hammered about this, and my conscience was pricked about that. And I've always remembered that. But I suppose for me, where things have kind of, it's kind of like, it's a bit like a snowball. It just builds, and you begin to feel more responsibility. One powerful moment for me was when I was in Myanmar after Cyclone Nargis, and I was in this small community that was right, in a landlocked area, and the water had come through, and it was pretty clear that some of the water wasn't going to leave because of the actual change in the water patterns in the area. And they described to me what it was like, the terror. They had lost 2 or 3 children because they had to walk. They stayed at one place, but the water was creeping up, and so they had to walk to the next place. And as they walked, the water rose, and it was up to their necks. And they walked by holding hands. And at one point, the line broke, and they lost 2 people. But this little family of 4 people had survived. And it struck me that in a powerful way, I started to think a bit more about there's something going on here that's bigger even than a cyclone. There's something going on, just another sign of the changes that we're dealing with in our climate patterns and what's going on in our world. And obviously there was lots of conversation about that particular disaster and how it too was another example of some of the concerns that we have now as there's climate change in our world. And I think it's just another connection. And then so for me, what we became more aware of at World Vision was how this is going to impact the poor. Our vision at World Vision is, we talk about our vision for every child is life in all its fullness, our prayer for every heart, the will to make it so. It's going to be much more difficult in the world that we're starting to imagine as a result of what's going on with climate change. It's tough enough for those folk now, but with what this is going to do, really, really is concerning. We've heard I think some good evidence from Graham already on, as we look at this in terms of its impact on people, we've heard some good evidence of that. So I don't want to repeat that. It's just more and more accepted that climate change is real and that it's going to continue to have a tremendous impact on our world. I try to back up a little bit and put myself in the place of perhaps some folk who just aren't so enthusiastic about this and have some criticisms of it. And yet I use a rather crude and somewhat shocking kind of imagery, and because we use this sometimes in the work we do with children around the world. But it's as if you're alongside a river, and as you're watching the river, you notice that this is horrendous to even think about this, but there's babies floating in the river. And it's just human to say, we've got to do something. So we rescue the babies, and that's a wonderful thing, but then we keep noticing that the babies keep flowing down the river, and they don't stop, until finally we say, what are we going to do to stop this? How do we get at the cause? And that's a little bit, I think, of what it seems to me that every person, I don't care where people stand on climate change, if there's babies floating down the river, we're all going to have to get involved. It's not optional. It's the human thing to do, it's the godly thing to do, it's the moral thing to do, it's the spiritual thing to do. But then the second piece is, are we going to continue to just let it happen and not try to deal with the root causes? I think that's the big question for us, is are we going to do that? And yes, there's debate about whether, on what this root cause is, but more and more I think the evidence is becoming more and more compelling. So when you move this to the faith issue, and Graham's given some of this already, but I just want to hit a little bit more, where it really gets an edge to it is when you think, for example, the poor live on the most marginal land in the world. The family that I was visiting, it's no surprise that they lost thousands of people in their communities. They're living on the worst land. It's marginal, it's dangerous, they have no choice. Or you'll see this in other parts of the world where there's heavy flooding, in places in Latin America, even in China, in rural China. It's the poorest people who live on this kind of land, and when there's a flood, when there's a change in climate, they're caught immediately. Issues around access to water. So many poor communities. The whole issue to just have water in our world is becoming increasingly difficult. And then on the whole food issue, we got a taste of that. It's not quite as bad now as it was a year ago, but when there was a combination of issues around trying to use, particularly maize, for example, corn, as a fuel to make gasoline for cars, fuel for cars. The cost just rocketed. That was one of the reasons. There was also a shortage in the world. And we got a glimpse of what it's like when the cost of food just rockets. It's up anywhere from 50 to 100%. The estimate by the World Bank was 100 million people moved into a new level of the worst poverty in our world just because of that particular event that was going on. And it led to food riots in a number of countries. People were killed. Haiti, for example, had huge food riots. And that cost of fuel, it affects the cost of fertilizer, it affects the cost of seed. All of that contributes. And we got a bit of a glimpse again of what happens when we don't have enough to feed people in our world. And so that brings this edge. If we're serious in our faith about, I always like to think, the vertical dimension is loving God, and then the horizontal dimension is loving the neighbor. That's what we're called to. I'm speaking particularly out of the Christian perspective here. Other faiths also talk about their obligation to care for other people and to be responsible for the care of our world. But loving our neighbor, loving God. And then it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination when I describe some of the things that are happening in our world today that affect the poor. The most vulnerable generally are the children. So that adds another dimension to this, and I like where Graham talked about it as the intergenerational. We're not just talking about adults, but we're talking about children, the most vulnerable. And so if they're caught in these areas, if they're living in these areas, what's going to happen to them becomes extremely, extremely serious.